You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 309 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Show's coming out a little bit late today. Wasn't feeling so great yesterday. Feeling a little bit better, and there's certainly a lot of news to cover. Some of the big headlines here are Walter Jones, the great congressman, has passed away. Trump's State of the Union address was last week. Trump has plans now to meet with Kim Jong-un at the end of February. The regime change effort in Venezuela is ongoing. And I do want to talk about the new information coming out about the Khashoggi murder. Take the time to either share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and the daily news roundup that I write are both there on the homepage. Just type in libertarianinstitute.org, and the latest news roundup and shows will be right there in front of your face. If you want to donate to the show and get access to the bonus content I put out, check out patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I talked a lot about Congressman Walter Jones on the show last week as he had entered hospice care, and he has passed away. Several-term congressman, Southern Republican, very conservative guy, also hugely anti-war, and he became that way after he realized that when he voted for the Iraq War, he made a huge mistake. And while in 2003 he was Mr. Freedom Fries because, the French were the wussies who wouldn't go to war with us in Iraq, by 2005, he was, writing notes to the survivors of U.S. soldiers who died in the Iraq War, saying that he's sorry he made a mistake voting for the thing. A couple of takeaways from Walter Jones and a couple of things I think are very important about him is that, kind of in the vein of Ron Paul, he was this Southern conservative who hated the wars and, for some of us who came from the right, certainly made it, a lot easier of a pill to swallow. I mean, listening to Barbara Lee talk about why she's against the wars, or, Jill Stein's yelling about the wars while chained to a bulldozer or something like that. Well, these are great and important things that are being done, but at the same time, it's not going to convince anybody who already identifies as, being a conservative. And so that, kind of profile of being anti-war and being conservative existed, in Ron Paul and Congressman Jones, and that's something important about his legacy. I think Thomas Massey is, very important now as, this younger congressman that represents Kentucky and, is very conservative and very, and knowledgeably so, anti-war. The other thing about Walter Jones that I really like is that he really understood the severity of his make in voting for the Iraq War. People like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, maybe like a Ted Cruz Republican, will come out and kind of say the regime change effort in Iraq wasn't helpful to the U.S. I don't know if they would go as far as to say the Bush administration lied about it. But at the end of the day, they really don't understand the severity of the consequences. That 1 million people died, 4,500 Americans, tens of thousands of injured, if not hundreds of thousands. And, that number, I'm sure, at least encroaches on, 1 million just alone from Iraq. When you look at, those who suffer from moral injury, mental health problems, addiction issues, because of the wars. In Iraq, specifically with 1 million. I'm sure, when you look at the terror wars as a whole, that those numbers start to escalate quite a bit. But when they, say that they're now against that war, that doesn't mean that factors into their decisions that they're going to consider one of the current wars. They're still going to be supportive of them. And they're going to say, yeah, Iraq was a mistake, but we're going to fix it this time for this reason. And they really don't seem all that apologetic about it. They say, yeah, it was a bad idea, but it's not like they're really holding themselves to account to say, man, I sent a lot of young Americans overseas to die. We killed a lot of innocent Iraqis, and some in the most brutal of ways, bombing houses of innocent civilians. And we really messed up, and I was one of those people that went along with all the lies when we should have known better in 2003. And so I'm really sorry about, that you don't get that from them. Hey, we shouldn't have done it. But, I absolutely made a mistake, and I'm going to look to make up for it for the rest of my life because that's how important that mistake was. So hopefully, these are the things we remember about Walter Jones and in his legacy, and, people reading what he wrote and said in Congress will be inspired to stand against the wars as well. All right, State of the Union stuff. I'm not going to do a whole show reaction to the State of the Union like I've done, I think, the past couple of years now. In part, this is because Pete Raymond, formerly Mance Raider, Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast host, which is also at the Libertarian Institute, had on Scott Horton and did an excellent breakdown, probably better than I could do if I tried for a very long time, of Trump's State of the Union address. So if you're interested in a kind of point-by-point breakdown of what Trump said related to foreign policy in the State of the Union, I think you could look at that. Jason Ditz also wrote a pretty good article, and another part of the reason I'm not, talking about this is just because Trump didn't really announce any policy changes or big steps in U.S. foreign policy during his State of the Union. I don't think he really even told any new lies or anything like that. So for those of you, who tune into this show every episode, you certainly wouldn't be hearing a whole lot of, anything you haven't heard in the last month on this show already, from the State of the Union. I will say, I think there was a notable absence. I had read 3 or 4 times in the past month from kind of mainstream sources that Trump had wanted to announce some kind of troop withdrawal. I think something very concrete during his State of the Union address, and we really didn't have this. And so I know they're now saying the end of April is kind of the timeline that everybody in the Pentagon says, well, we don't have a firm timeline, but it does seem like the pace of things is to withdraw U.S. troops by the end of April. And we're also supposed to see a significant reduction of Afghan troops by April as well. But, Donald Trump didn't come out here in his thing and said, X number of troops will be home by X date. So disappointing that wasn't included in the speech, but I didn't see anything about it in the past couple of weeks. So I guess that hope should have really been, dampened on my end. The other kind of bigger talking point from his foreign policy section of the State of the Union, of course, is on North Korea, where we have since had Trump send out tweets saying that he's meeting with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, Vietnam on February 27th and 28th. So there's a couple of significant things about that. Of course, one of the biggest blunders for the U.S. empire ever is the intervention in Vietnam, and for, Donald Trump to be returning there as an American president, this time to negotiate peace talks with, I think, what could be seen as another kind of, U.S. blunder there with the Korean War, although certainly a less well-known one, and possibly negotiating the end to that. I haven't read anything kind of great yet on the significance of the location of this, hopefully, what will happen meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, but it is going to happen in the next couple of weeks here. I think one of the things I've learned about diplomacy since starting this show, and maybe it should be, pretty obvious, is that when Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un actually sit down, it's not like they're going to hammer out hours worth of kind of talking points and discussions here. It's not going to be like they meet 3 days, 10 hours a day, and they work out all these little details. My guess is all of that is going on right now between U.S. and North Korean officials. And in fact, we had Donald Trump send out a tweet saying that his representatives had just returned from North Korea, and he was very optimistic. So my guess is that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un will attend this meeting in Hanoi with a pretty good knowledge beforehand what they expect will come out of it. Maybe one or the other refuses to sign something at the last minute, but I think these details are generally worked out so that the general atmosphere of the meeting is going to be positive. However, there is going to be an important opportunity here for Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un to speak directly with each other. So certainly on the American end, when things come through the filter of the war hawks, whether it be John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, all the different members of the National Security Council, the current head of the DOD, Patrick Shanahan, any of the intelligence chairs, Coates, Haspel, Wray, when information comes through those channels, I'm guessing that all has their kind of war hawk tint on it. But when Donald Trump gets to talk to Kim Jong-un one-on-one with just the translators, maybe this is the opportunity for him to really kind of understand why Kim Jong-un is taking the positions that he's taken. My guess is that it's a more or less same situation in North Korea, in that everybody kind of who's doing the negotiating and then their boss gets to put their slant on what the Americans are saying and why. And so, maybe Kim Jong-un understands things from the American position better after talking with Trump. At least from what, I see from these two leaders publicly, I wouldn't count them as the best at articulating, kind of the needs and the reasons why for their country. I guess Kim Jong-un a little bit, but, I've often talked on the show about Putin in that I feel like he does a very good job of explaining why Russia is taking the steps that they're taking, even when they're hawkish towards the United States. And he's very good at explaining why the Russian people and the Russian government are taking whatever position for whatever reason. Maybe in a one-on-one conversation, Donald Trump is better at this than when he's speaking at the podium. Kim Jong-un, I mean, part of the hard part here is that I don't speak any Korean, and a lot of what I see coming out from Korea isn't necessarily directly from the mouth of Kim Jong-un, but it's through the kind of propaganda source of the newspapers and all that. Also, Kim Jong-un has, I think, a lot kind of smaller access to the media in general, where if Putin goes and speaks at an event in Russia, it's well covered by at least parts of the U.S. media, certainly like the print media what I read, but Kim Jong-un, not quite so much. As far as what comes out of these talks, I don't know how optimistic to be yet. I guess, we'll see in the lead up to the talks as, the different diplomats from each side who are doing the negotiations start to leak out their positions and all this other stuff. We'll learn more and more about what to expect. My guess is that, kind of on the table is a official end to the Korean War, maybe a disclosure of the location of North Korean nuclear weapons. I'm hoping that there's some kind of concrete steps, like North Korea will disclose the location of so many nuclear weapons, and the United States will relieve sanctions, allowing North and South Korean, infrastructure projects along the DMZ or something like that. Things that could be taken and then shown to be happening. The reason why I think these concrete measures are important is because it's going to make it harder and harder to say that these Korean talks aren't amounting to anything. Now, the negative is obvious that the Hawks are going to be out in full force saying that Donald Trump is caving to Kim Jong-un, that Donald Trump loves dictators. Of course, there's going to be these, kind of ridiculous things from the PC left that condemns people for making gay jokes, are going to then, draw pictures of Donald Trump kissing up to Kim Jong-un or implying that he's doing sexual things to the guy, which would seem to me to be some kind of like homophobic slam if done by somebody on the right. But these are the kind of attacks that they're going to get. And I am kind of worried that, kind of telling Donald Trump that he is the, lover boy of Kim Jong-un may be something that actually causes him to be skeptical here. But the attacks are going to come. They're going to say that nothing came out of the first round of talks, that Donald Trump will be taken advantage of by Kim Jong-un, that Kim Jong-un is going to get too much from us, that we can't negotiate, that we can't compromise at all. In fact, they're going to show Donald Trump saying that, Kim Jong-un and North Korea had to make all the concessions before we make a single one. But I guess the good news is that Donald Trump doesn't care at all if he flip-flops on issues. So while they're going to be throwing that in his face, hopefully he's going to be going over there and shaking hands and making peace and all that good stuff. This will be a hot topic on the show in the next couple of weeks. The only other kind of Korean news I have for you is the United States finally reached an agreement with South Korea on the cost and who's going to actually be paying for the U.S. troops that are deployed to South Korea. There's a couple weeks there where the talks really seemed to have stalled out. They weren't making any progress either way. I was kind of holding my breath that Donald Trump may withdraw some forces from there just because he couldn't get the Koreans to pay more, to have the U.S. troops there. I think Donald Trump was demanding a pretty steep increase in the price, and people are speculating that because we haven't seen Donald Trump out there on Twitter bragging about he got Moon Jae-in, the fantastic leader of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, to take more of the, the share of the cost of the U.S. troop deployment to South Korea off the shoulders of Americans, suggests that, the South Koreans are probably paying closer to the rate that they were paying before these talks all happened. But, I guess it was a little too optimistic to think that U.S. troops would go home just because we couldn't figure out who was paying more for them, especially because, this would be a large political expenditure for Donald Trump to bring U.S. troops home for South Korea for any reason. It would be seen as being a cave to Kim Jong-un, or at least slanted that way and spun that way. So I guess that was doubtful to begin with, but, U.S. troops look like they're staying in South Korea for quite a while longer. All right, a couple weapons things I want to mention here. The Air Force says they're going to look to procure some F-15X's. I think this is an example of a somewhat interesting split within the kind of deep state military industrial complex, whatever the hell you want to call it, between Boeing and Lockheed Martin, despite the fact that Lockheed Martin has made the F-35, which is supposed to be the new great generation of U.S. fighter that could do anything. Turns out it could do nothing. So Boeing isn't just sitting back and saying, well, you got, this generation of fighter and we'll try to get the next one. They're going out there trying to kind of come up with their own and outsell Lockheed Martin on this one. The most disappointing about this situation here is that really the legacy media, especially on the left, has been so willing to attack Donald Trump over corruption and all this other stuff. And yet here they have a case where Trump just appoints the acting Secretary of Defense. This guy isn't even confirmed by Congress. He's a longtime executive of Boeing. And here he is approving well, I guess he's not approving because he's excused himself from the decision making. But here the Pentagon is taking all these steps towards buying more and more Boeing products. Seems to me like there may be a little bit of conflict of influence there. And hell, even if the guy's like, oh, I excuse myself from the decision-making progress on whether to buy an F-15X versus an F-35, everybody at the Pentagon is aware of the history of their boss and what company that he worked for. And without, Donald Trump having not even nominated now, somebody to become permanent Secretary of Defense, I guess they figured that, hell, we could, be here long enough that the new guy's giving out promotions. We better say nice things about his company. I found this story to be interesting. I'm not sure quite what to make out of it yet, but the United States is buying some Iron Dome missile defense or aerial defense systems from Israel. The first interesting part here is that we're buying it. We give this country billions of dollars worth of aid a year, and then we end up having to buy their products on top of it. And they also said that this was to fill an immediate need. That's from the Pentagon. So it's interesting to think what the immediate need of the United States would be here. Is it maybe the Taliban or ISIS-K using some kind of drones or larger rockets in Afghanistan? Are they going to somehow use it to facilitate the U.S. withdrawal in Syria? Does it have something to do with Yemen? We know the Houthis are pretty capable in their ballistic and drone capabilities. So where's it going to be deployed? What's it for? Since it apparently is going to fill an immediate need. Of course, it could all just be trying to get more money over to Israel. And we see this all the time. The Congress is very supportive of Israel. And I will say, I think it's worth noting that it's not just the Israel lobby or the influence from Israel on the United States, but it's also people who are American centrist war hawks who see the United States relationship with Israel to be, I think, very productive to their not only overall worldview, but also the people they want to see and the people who they back. So, Israel buys a lot of U.S. defense projects with the money they give them. So the weapons makers like it. A lot more people in Israel are either from the West or speak English. And so, for that reason, it's good propaganda. It's easier to sway the congressman. So anyways, my point there was just that there's, it's not all the Israel lobby, but boy, do the pro-Israel positions hold a lot of sway in Washington now. We have this anti-BDS bill going through the Senate. I don't know, it might stall out in the House with the Democrat majority, but basically what this bill would allow to happen, among other things, is for states to, not do business with companies because they boycott Israel. So it seems like kind of a freedom of speech thing there, but, we'll see what happens. I doubt the court would take it up. All right, the last thing on weapons is the INF treaty between the U.S. and Russia. And I hope you guys listen to the show more than this just one episode. And kind of what I talked about the past couple months with the INF treaty banning intermediate range ground-based missiles and their launchers 500 to 5,500 kilometers. U.S. and Russia are signatories negotiated towards the end of the Cold War there. It's a hugely important treaty for kind of taking nuclear weapons off of hair triggers, shorter range, shorter trigger figure as far as figuring out if it's going to hit any important targets and what this flying object is. But it also helped to kind of denuclearize and take Europe off the map for being potential targets by Russia for nuclear weapons. The U.S. is the one who's really been complaining about this treaty. Russia has, said several times that the U.S. is violating the treaty, but to my knowledge had never actually looked to vacate it and had really tried to get the U.S. to engage in talks to agree to stay within the treaty, mostly focused on how, the United States felt Russia wasn't living up to its end of the treaty. I am somewhat concerned about, we still have 6 months here before the treaty is completely gone, to maybe come to the table and work something out here. And I guess it's not completely like an un-Trumpian position, especially if the people he is listening to are Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, who we know loves crushing nuclear weapons treaties, to think that, he could kind of enter this stage of the treaty and then bring Russia to the table and save it when they agree to, destroy their weapon that we say is in violation of the treaty. However, it seems now that Russia is taking a little bit of a stronger position on the U.S. violations of the treaty, saying that Russia wouldn't re-enter the treaty unless the U.S. did two things. One is to destroy the Mk-41 missile launchers in Romania. Now, these are part of the U.S. Patriot missile systems, and as I said in the beginning here, that the INF treaty bans ground-based missiles and their launchers with the range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. These Mk-41 launchers are on a lot of ships, I think including submarines and destroyers, and they launch Tomahawk missiles, which I think are potentially nuclear missiles and have like an intermediate range there that falls between the 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So, in a very short amount of time, the U.S. could convert the ground-based launchers in Romania into launchers that could potentially put a nuclear-loaded missile on it. And so, to me, it kind of made sense looking at the Russian argument here that these would be technical violations of the treaty. Not that Russia ever said that the U.S. had to dismantle it or they would get out of the treaty and start making intermediate-range nuclear weapons before the United States decided to vacate the treaty. The other Russian complaint, and to me this one seems a little bit more questionable, is Russia is demanding that the U.S. destroy their drone programs, their strike drones, as these could carry nuclear weapons, and I guess are, just pieces of metal, and they could fly into Russia with a nuclear weapon and, blow something up 1,000 kilometers into Russia. But again, this one to me seems, I'm a little bit more questionable. It seems like drone technology is different from what they were talking about in the INF treaty. In the past on the show, I had talked about how I felt like the U.S. was in a more strategic position staying within the treaty. And this is something that I recently read in Bloomberg by their editorial board. So it's nice to see somebody in the mainstream media getting something right for a change. And what they explain is it would have been more strategic for the U.S. to stay in the treaty. When you look at now what's going to happen, the U.S. is saying we don't even have plans to make a missile, a ground-based missile to fit in this, maybe a 2,500 kilometer nuclear capable missile or something like that. Whereas Russia is saying that they are going to go ahead and make those missiles. So this may be another situation like where I talked about with the ABM treaty, where the U.S. ends up in a worse strategic position having vacated the treaty than they were just staying in it. And again, Russia was more than willing, I think, prior to the U.S. vacating this treaty to stay within it, even though they believed the U.S. was violating it. Khashoggi murder. The quick story here is that a UN investigator said they concluded that Saudi officials premeditated the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I think the bigger story appeared in the New York Times. It says that U.S. intelligence agencies, I believe the CIA and the NSA, are sifting through years of conversations that they have recorded and I guess digital copies by Mohammed bin Salman and are analyzing those. Mohammed bin Salman is of course the crown prince and considered by many to be the main power broker, the leader of the Saudi state and the Saudi royal family at this point. And the big news is that the U.S. intelligence agencies say they found a case where Mohammed bin Salman is talking to an advisor saying that we need to get Jamal Khashoggi back into the Saudi Arabia. And if we have to, we'll have to compel him to do it. If he won't come here willingly, I think at one point they were talking about maybe offering him a job at Saudi state media. Then what we're going to do is we're going to try to strong arm him into it. They don't go into detail here, maybe threaten him, threaten his family or something like that. And then Mohammed bin Salman says if we can't compel him, we could use a bullet. So saying that he's going to kill him. In some ways, this has been dismissed as a joke saying, oh, this is something like, what Hillary Clinton said about droning Julian Assange. But at the same time, you do have a head of state who said that he was going to use a bullet to kill somebody that members of his state later killed. And it's also worth noting that we saw Saudi Arabia try to bring Jamal Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia and I think compel him to do so as well. And he refused, and so this was their way of getting him back into the country. They did it by, cutting him up and bringing him there in pieces. Something that I've talked about in the past, I believe on Joanne Leone's show, and a point that she really likes to make here, is that the U.S. intelligence agencies don't necessarily agree with the president in favoring the Mohammed bin Salman wing of the Saudi royal family as, the political future leadership of Saudi Arabia. And so if they end up sifting through these 2 or 3, years worth of conversations of Mohammed bin Salman, they might find evidence of war crimes in Yemen or just terrible things he said about the Yemen war. Certainly Saudi Arabia has done many cruel things within their state to their own people, war crimes against Shiite minorities, vast oppression of women. And so if they find Mohammed bin Salman talking about these kind of things in unfavorable ways and leak it to the media, it could really be a way to push to try to get Mohammed bin Salman out of power there. And while it looks like, that this story may have faded, it happened in October, and by the time we got to December, all this other stuff's going on. Nobody knows who Jamal Khashoggi is anymore. It could be powerful. The other important thing here, too, is with the Yemen War Powers Act resolutions, our bills being introduced in the House and Senate again, having any kind of anti-Saudi Arabia news could be very, very helpful in ending that war. All right, last thing I'll talk about on today's show is Venezuela, the regime change effort going on there. A very interesting take on it by Justin Raimondo, where he basically says that Donald Trump okayed Bolton and the rest of the neocons to do this, knowing that it would fail, and then Donald Trump would turn around and kind of blame him and mock him, and this was a whole fake thing by Donald Trump since the beginning. Not sure I'm completely on board with that, but I can certainly see it more or less playing out that way. That if this really does turn out to be the flop it looks like it is now, the military is not going to go along with the U.S.-backed Guaido government there. And Maduro still has enough popular support in the country to, not have uprisings and people demanding, at the doors of his presidential palace that he leave power. Then it really doesn't look like this regime change is going to happen. It's a failed kind of thing that the U.S. tried to do. And if it turns out to just sputter out here, pretty spectacularly so. This did not work at all. It didn't even generate a lot of violence in Venezuela. And, in the past on the show, not to sound pessimistic or cruel, but I was actually surprised by the lack of violence in Venezuela. I thought the right-wing movements and anybody who opposed Maduro would really look to exploit this as an opportunity. You go and set a couple police cars on fire, or, at one point they had some, guy commandeer a helicopter and try to grenade the Supreme Court from the helicopter. Doing these kind of things could provoke the government into carrying out some pretty violent reactions, and then you say, oh, look how evil and stupid and terrible Maduro is, we must overthrow him. Haven't even seen a lot of that. So I'm not sure I agree that this was Trump's plot all along, but certainly I hope this is how he takes it from here and just blames all the neocons and, kind of mods them like he's done to so many other people in his administration that he feels like failed him. Bad news category here is that apparently Donald Trump has been taking advice from Marco Rubio on Venezuela, and the man once mocked by Donald Trump as Little Marco, apparently now giving him advice on wars. It would be a bad thing. Now, Raimondo's right. He invites Little Marco in just so he can mock him about it later. But man, Marco Rubio is not very sharp in a pawn of the war state. So this is something to watch out for. If he really does have influence over Trump on this one, we could see the bad situation going on where obviously the facts on the ground in Venezuela don't indicate any kind of regime changes coming, but that the United States start escalating further and further and further until they give themselves an excuse to carry out regime change. So, maybe a situation where they start to bring aid of some kind into Venezuela against the Maduro government. Somehow a shootout takes place either by Maduro's forces or pro-Maduro people. American aid workers get killed, or hell, even aid workers, international aid workers of any kind get killed. And suddenly the U.S. is saying, oh, now we have to go in Venezuela to protect these humanitarian aid corridors. And that turns into a full-scale regime operation, mission creep style, within a couple of years. The U.S. has been really attempting to court the military. Doesn't seem like it's going to happen, though. I feel like if it was going to happen, it already would. Something that I believe Matt Blumenthal pointed this out on the Scott Horton show, that a lot of these current, I think, military generals and high-ranking military officers in the Venezuelan military were the Chavez revolutionaries. And so, now they're senior military officers and all that, but I'm guessing a lot of them still have those ideological ties to the Chavez government and the Maduro revolution. The U.S. is just flat out rejecting talks at this point. Disappointing to see. Anytime you can have talks, better than having any kind of violent conflict or these U.S. regime change efforts. I'm not sure if there's really a deal that could be done between the Maduro government and the U.S. at this point, just because I don't know what Maduro really has to agree to. It's kind of like those points that Mike Pompeo made against Iran, that Iran either wasn't meeting them or they were just fictional. And so I'm not sure what good talks would do, just because there wasn't anything for the Iranians to do to meet the U.S. goals. But hell, talks are always good to see what could happen. I'm seeing these new lies coming out that Venezuela is tied to Hezbollah. And of course, from Hezbollah, you get to Iran, and from Iran, you get to Russia and China. And so now you got all the evil people in the world all tied together in a nice little bundle for the war state. I haven't seen any real good evidence of anything here yet. So if anybody brings this up, I would just, be skeptical. Like, what's the evidence? How do you know? Another big point is just like if the U.S. kind of cuts all these people and isolates them out of the rest of the world economy, it kind of made sense that you're driving them all together just a little bit. I read an interesting story in Bloomberg here about a Turkish company that was set up and exported about, I think, $900 million of Venezuelan gold from Venezuela to Turkey and then sold it somehow. I'm not sure how much of this money has since gotten back to the Maduro government. All these transactions did occur before November, so I don't think would have been technical violations of any U.S. sanctions. But as I was talking about before, I think this is an example of the larger picture. The more sanctions that the U.S. puts on all these individual countries around the world, the more they're all going to look to do end runs around the United States. Well, Turkey hasn't been heavily sanctioned by the United States. Turkey does a lot of business with countries who have. And I think Turkey has really started to look to, kind of find ways to do business outside of the, U.S. IMF SWIFT system. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. A little bit on the longer side today. I'll probably be, again, a little bit on the longer side on Wednesday's show, as I have a lot to talk about. Iran, Afghanistan, Yemen, Yellow Vest protests, Syria, Somalia. So I'm going to try to fly through all that again on that show, but I really hope you're enjoying it. If you got things you want me to talk about that I haven't, you can always do that. Just give me some kind of feedback. Hope you're enjoying the show. Online, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com. My work's now being posted at the LP Mises Caucus. I'm very proud to have my work there with so many other great libertarians, and I think with the best wing of the Libertarian Party. Check me out on minds.com. I'm at Immersion News there. Twitter at KYAAALE. There's a private Facebook group. At some point, I'd like to merge that somewhere else, but hell, it's there. It's somewhat active, so check that out as well. Thanks, everybody.